The worst crimes are not committed in the dark, but in broad daylight, among faces we think we know. Welcome to English Crime Files. Step into the archives as we uncover another gripping case from the dark side of history. 30 years of murder. South of Casablanca, past where the postcards stop pretending. Here the Atlantic wind loses its mercy. It turns hot and gritty, dragging itself through half-finished cinder-block houses, auto shops, and empty lots where stray dogs sleep in the shadow of rusted-out trucks. This is a landscape built from dust and diesel, from dreams that never finished and desperation too quiet to notice. And it was here, in a semi-rural commune called Dar el-Khair, that one of the most unsettling secrets in modern Moroccan criminal history sat waiting. Not buried in some far-off desert, not hidden in a forest, but pressed directly beneath the tiled floor of a neighborhood cafe, where men gathered every day to drink mint tea and forget their troubles. The cafe was called Café Berrada. To the people of Dar el-Khair, it was nothing remarkable. Plastic chairs, a scratch counter, a television locked permanently on a football match. Its owner was a man named Said Berrada. By every account, a respectable man. Early 60s, broad-shouldered, a calm smile, the rough hands of someone who'd worked his whole life. He came from a family that had once held wide stretches of land in the region, a family known for quiet influence and longer memory. Said was generous, too. He'd wave off a customer's tab, slip a neighbor a small loan, pour free tea for the unemployed. The kind of man you nodded to on the street without a second thought. The kind you trusted before you even decided to. Nobody in Dar el-Khair had any reason to fear him. But beneath the cafe, beneath the laughter, the clatter of dominoes, the smell of brewing coffee and grilled sardines, something had been festering for 30 years. An entire generation. And in all that time, the man behind the counter, the one who knew everyone's name, who asked after your mother and your children, had walked to and from his cafe every single day directly above the remains of the people he had murdered. It started, as these things so often do, with something painfully mundane. A block drain. Late summer, 2012. Weeks of foul water pooling in the back room finally pushed Said Berrada to hire 2-day laborers to dig up a section of the cafe's rear floor. The work was slow, ugly. The concrete was old and stubborn, cracking under pickaxes swung by men whose shirts had gone dark with sweat, whose faces streaked with grime in the suffocating heat. The air inside sat thick with stale tobacco, damp earth, and something else, sharp, chemical, tar-like. At first they figured it was old waterproofing, some forgotten building material. But as they dug deeper, one man's shovel struck something solid. Not stone, not pipe, something hollow. He knelt, brushed the soil back with his fingers, and froze. A human skull stared up at him, its sockets packed with dark, compacted earth. The laborer stumbled back, shouting for his companion. For a long moment neither man moved, unable to process what lay in front of them. The cafe had gone silent, save for a fly buzzing near the doorway. Outside, the sun hung high and blinding. Inside, beneath the floor of this ordinary cafe, the ground had just cracked open a door into darkness. The Gendarmerie Royale arrived within the hour, blue lights painting the dusty street in flashes of cold color. Officers in khaki cordoned off the building, pushing back a crowd already gathering at the edges. Neighbors watched from doorways and rooftops, faces tight with fear and the particular hunger of morbid curiosity. In Morocco, where community means everything, a discovery like this wasn't just a crime. It was a rupture in the most sacred kind of trust. A body under a cafe meant someone among them, someone they passed every day, had been living a monstrous lie. The forensic team moved with method. Portable lights, generators, careful sweeps of the floor, every inch photographed before the slow work of excavation began. What they found ran their blood cold. Not one body, several. The bones tangled with black tar residue, the source of that strange chemical smell. Tar poured over the remains, layer after layer, sealing in the odor of decay. This wasn't a killing born of passion. This was calculated, practiced, the work of someone who'd buried secrets before and knew exactly how to keep them buried. The investigators looked around. Faded posters, an old cash register, cheap plastic chairs now dusted with forensic powder. And then they looked at the man who owned it all. Said Berrada had arrived not long after the police. He stood outside the yellow tape, arms crossed, watching the scene with an expression hard to read. No panic, no tears, no frantic questions, just watching, calm as a man surveying a delivery of flour. When an officer approached and asked if he knew anything about the remains, he shook his head slowly. "It's an old building," he said. "Maybe it's from before my time. Maybe it's an old burial. I don't know." But the officer caught something in his eyes. Not fear, exactly, but the cold, practiced stillness of a man who'd spent a lifetime controlling his own face. The officer made a note in his pad, and said not to leave town. As the sun dropped over Dar el-Khair, the forensic team kept digging. The pile of bones grew. The stench of old death, freed after so many years, hung in the air despite the tar. The crowd outside didn't disperse. They stood in silence, watching the cafe where they'd laughed and argued and lived their small daily lives get swallowed by a crime scene. And in the middle of it all, the owner stood motionless, watching police unearth what he had spent 30 years hiding. No one yet understood the scope of it. No one yet knew this cafe wasn't just a crime scene. It was a cemetery, a private graveyard built by a man who had killed again and again across 3 decades, always hiding in plain sight. A man who murdered his own family for land, who strangled a tenant for refusing to leave, who slaughtered a cemetery guard and his wife, who silenced a waitress who knew too much, a man who had perfected the art of disappearance. But on that first night, as floodlights clicked on and forensic experts knelt over the bones, the investigators had only one question. Who was Said Berrada? Really? The answer would drag them through a labyrinth of forged documents, missing relatives, and a trail of death stretching back to the 1980s. It would expose the darkest corners of a respected family, the corruption of local officials, and the terrifying ease with which a monster can pass for a neighbor. The bones under the cafe were only the beginning. Beneath them lay a story so twisted, so cold-blooded, it would haunt the people of Dar el-Khair for the rest of their lives. And it all started with a blocked drain. The morning after the discovery, The sky over Dar El Khair hung pale and washed out gray, as if even the sun couldn't bear to look at what had been unearthed. The café, which had once carried the smell of espresso and grilling meat, now reeked of damp soil, old tar, and the unmistakable metallic sweetness of human decay. Forensic anthropologists arrived from Casablanca in a white van, their equipment packed into heavy black cases. White suits, masks, latex gloves. They moved through the scene with the quiet precision of surgeons in a field hospital. Inside, the excavation widened. The original hole in the rear floor stretched into a shallow, irregular pit beneath what had once been the kitchen. The floor had been laid in layers over the years. Concrete, tile, more concrete, but underneath it all sat a grave. Not a proper one, not a respectful one. A dumping ground where bodies had been folded into the earth and sealed with bitumen. By the end of the second day, the team had recovered the remains of at least 3 individuals. The bones lay jumbled, some broken, some missing, skulls marked with violent fractures. One skeleton, the oldest, sat buried deepest, its bones stained dark from years pressed against tar. The forensic pathologist on site, a woman named Dr. Salma Benuna, noted that the body's position suggested it had been thrown in and covered quickly, arms still raised, as if shielding the head. No buttons, no belt buckle, no personal effects, just bone and the black residue of a killer's failed attempt to erase it all. Detective Inspector Hassan El Mansouri stood at the edge of the pit, trench coat buttoned against the cold, his face unreadable. 25 years in the judicial police. First Casablanca, then the rural communes, where crime moved quieter but cut no less deep. He'd pulled bodies from wells, from septic tanks, from the trunks of abandoned cars. But this, a cafe doubling as a tomb, this was something else. Not a crime of passion, a crime of routine. He turned to the owner, seated on a plastic chair outside the tape, flanked by 2 gendarmes. Said El Berrada had been questioned briefly the night before, but not arrested. No legal basis yet. He was a property owner, a respected man, and the bones could have predated his ownership entirely. But El Mansouri didn't believe in coincidence. He believed in patterns. The inspector pulled a small notebook from his pocket and settled onto an overturned crate across from said. The street sat quiet around them, though windows up and down it were full of watching eyes. Mr. El Berrada, the inspector began, voice low and even. How long have you owned this cafe? Said looked up, expression calm, almost courteous. Since 1987, he said. Before that, it belonged to my father's brother, my uncle. And what happened to your uncle? A pause. Set's right hand, resting on his knee, tightened just slightly. He sold me the land and left. That was in 1981. Went to Algeria, I think. Never came back. You think? You don't know. He was a difficult man. We weren't close. El Mansouri wrote something down, then looked up again, and the tar under the floor. Who put it there? I did, said answer without hesitation. In 88 or 89, the ground was damp. I poured tar to seal the moisture. Old technique. The inspector nodded slowly. Did you know there were bodies under your floor? Said held his gaze. No flinch, no flicker. "No," he said. "How could I know?" A perfectly reasonable answer. Too reasonable. In El Mansouri's experience, innocent men stammered when asked a question like that, or cried, or grew angry. They didn't sit with their hands folded, answering like it was a matter of business. But he said nothing. He closed his notebook and stood. "Don't leave the area," he said. "We'll have more questions." As the inspector walked back toward the forensic team, Dr. Benuna pulled down her mask, her face tired but sharp. "The oldest remains," she said quietly. "Can't be certain without DNA, but the fracture pattern on the skull is consistent with blunt force trauma. Repeated blows, killed elsewhere, buried hereafter, and the tar poured in layers over several years. This wasn't a one-time burial. This was a place he kept coming back to." El Mansouri glanced back at Said, still on his plastic chair, staring at the ground. Then at the cafe, the faded sign, the cheap tables, the stacked chairs. How many people had sat there drinking tea, while beneath them, the dead lay waiting? That afternoon, the inspector drove to the local land registry in Mediuna. Old building, bureaucratic to its bones, towering shelves of paper and the smell of dust and ink. He requested the record for the cafe and for a 2-hectare plot known locally as Albur al-Jadid, the New Well. What he found there set the hairs on the back of his neck standing. The land had originally belonged to a man named Qasim el-Berrada in 1981, the same year Qasim was said to have vanished. A sale contract registered the land's transfer to his nephew, Said. The signature claiming to be Qasim's carried the stamp of a local official from the FIDA district. But the signature itself was strange, too uniform, the loops of the Arabic letters too perfect, too consistent. Less like a signature, more like an imitation. El Mansouri photocopied everything and returned to his office as the afternoon light thinned. He spread the documents across his desk beside a map of the commune and his early forensic notes, then called the Central Archives asking for any missing persons reports involving the El Berrada family from the early 80s. The answer came within hours. 2 reports. The first, Qasim El Berrada, 61, reported missing March 1981. The second, Qasim's sister, late 50s, vanished the following year. In both cases, the filings hadn't come from Said. They'd come from distant relatives, and both had closed within weeks for lack of evidence. And in both cases, the last person known to have seen them was the same man, Said El Berrada. The inspector leaned back, staring at the rain-streaked window. The city had gone dark outside, streetlights throwing long shadows. On his desk, the black and white photograph of the missing uncle seemed to stare back, a solemn, bearded man in a white jalaba, eyes carrying a weariness only the dead can wear. For 30 years, the people of Dar el-Khair had believed Qasim simply left. They'd accepted his nephew's story, that the old man sold his land and went to Algeria because it was easier than asking questions, because Said was one of them, because he was respectable, because he owned the cafe where everyone gathered, and because nobody wanted to believe the man pouring their tea had buried his own family beneath the floor. But the bones were speaking now, and they were telling a story nobody in Dar el-Khair wanted to hear. As the night deepened, El Mansouri picked up the phone and dialed the forensic lab. "Dr. Benuna," he said, voice thick with fatigue, "prioritize the DNA on the oldest remains. I need a name." He paused, listening to the rain against the glass. "Because if I'm right," he said finally, "this is just the beginning. And the man we're looking for has been hiding in plain sight for 30 years. The investigation into the bones beneath Café Berrada didn't move fast, not at first. In Morocco, as everywhere, the machinery of justice grinds slow, weighed down by bureaucracy, family influence, and the deep, stubborn silence of small communities. But Detective Inspector Hassan El Mansouri wasn't a man who let silence stop him. He'd learned long ago that silence like this was never truly empty. It was full, packed with secrets, pressed down like earth over a grave. The forensic lab in Casablanca worked through the night. Dr. Salma Benuna and her team pulled DNA from the oldest remains, the ones buried deepest beneath the cafe floor. The bones were fragile, darkened by decades of tar and soil, but the genetic material had held. The sample went up against DNA volunteered by a surviving relative of Qasim Berrada, a distant cousin who'd never bought the story about Algeria. The results landed on the third day. A match. Qasim Berrada had never gone to Algeria, never sold his land and walked away. He'd been murdered, his body folded into a shallow grave beneath the cafe his nephew would go on to own and run for 25 years. The man who claimed to have bought the property from him had, in fact, killed him for it. When the news reached El Mansouri, he didn't celebrate. He sat at his desk, phone still pressed to his ear, staring at the photograph pinned to his evidence board. The old man's eyes seemed to accuse him from beyond the grave. Not him exactly, but the world that had let this happen. 30 years of lies, of forged documents, of a family too afraid or too complicit to ask the hard questions. He called his superior, a police commissioner in Casablanca named Mohammed Al-Adrissai, a career administrator, a man who prized order and discretion above all else. When he heard the details, he went quiet for a long moment. "Are you certain?" Al-Adrissai asked. "The DNA is conclusive. The remains belong to Qasim Berrada, and the property records show said forged his uncle's signature to transfer the land to himself. The pattern repeats in other documents. This isn't isolated." The commissioner sighed. "Then bring him in. But be careful, Hassan. This man has connections. His family carries weight in the commune. Move too fast, and we risk losing everything." El Mansouri understood the danger. In cases tangled up with land, money, and family honor, the line between witness and accomplice blurred fast. He needed more than a DNA match. He needed a confession. The next morning, said Berrada was summoned to the gendarmerie station in Medina for what was billed as a routine follow-up. He arrived in a clean white shirt and dark trousers, freshly shaved, manner as calm as ever. He greeted the officers politely and took his seat in the small interrogation room, crossing his legs like a man settling in for coffee. Inspector El Mansouri entered carrying a folder, set it on the table, and sat down across from him. The room was bare, dull institutional green walls, A fluorescent light flickering overhead. No window, just a small vent letting in the distant hum of traffic. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Berrada," the inspector began. "A few more questions about the remains under your cafe." Said nodded. "Of course. I want to help." "Good," Mansuri said, "because we've identified one of the bodies." A flicker, just for an instant, the calm mask slipped. Set's eyes widened, then narrowed. His hands, resting in his lap, moved to grip the arms of the chair. "Who?" he asked quietly. The inspector slid the black and white photograph across the table, the same one pinned to his board. Qasim Berrada's face stared up, solemn, unreadable. "Your uncle," Mansuri said. "Qasim Berrada, the man you say sold you the land and left for Algeria in 1981. Said looked at the photograph a long time. Color drained from his face, but he didn't break. "That's impossible," he said. "My uncle left. He signed the papers. I have witnesses." "Witnesses? Who?" "Family members. They saw the documents." Mansuri leaned in. "We've examined those documents, Mr. Berrada. The signature on the sale contract doesn't match your uncle's known handwriting. It matches yours." "That's a lie," said snapped, voice rising. "The papers are legal, stamped by the authorities, stamped by an official in the FIDA district we've since identified as a known forger. We've arrested him. He's talking." A bluff, a calculated one. The inspector hadn't made that arrest yet, only pulled the man's file, but the reputation was well known enough to sell the lie. And it landed. Said's composure cracked just enough for Mansuri to catch the fear underneath. Cold, animal fear. The fear of a man who'd spent decades building a fortress of lies and was now watching the walls come down. "I want a lawyer," said suddenly. Mansuri nodded slowly. "Of course. But before you call, let me tell you what we found. The bones under your cafe were covered in tar. The same tar you admitted pouring. The same tar sitting in barrels in your storage room, with your fingerprints on them. And we have your uncle's body, buried under your own floor, skull fractured by repeated blows." Said nothing, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the wall. "We also have records," the inspector went on, "of other disappearances. Your aunt, your cousin, a tenant who wouldn't leave, a cemetery guard and his wife, a waitress who worked in your cafe, all gone over the past 30 years, all last seen with you." "Those are rumors," said whispered. "Old stories. I had nothing to do with them." "Then explain the bones," Mansuri said. "Explain the DNA match. Explain the forged documents. Because right now, Mr. Berrada, the evidence is telling a story about a man who killed his own family for property and spent 30 years hiding the bodies beneath the place where he served tea to his neighbors." Silence swallowed the room. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once, then quieted. Said sat motionless, his face a mask of barely controlled rage and fear. Then, slowly, he turned and looked the inspector dead in the eye. "You will never prove it," he said softly. "You have bones, but bones don't speak. They don't testify. They're just bones." Mansuri rose, gathered the folder and the photograph, and paused at the door. He looked back, eyes hard. Maybe not, he said, but the living do. And there are people in Dar el-Khair finally ready to talk. He left, the door closing behind him. Alone, said Berrada stared at the empty chair across the table, his mind racing through 30 years of secrets, 30 years of lies, 30 years of death. He wasn't arrested yet, but he knew the truth was coming. And for the first time in 3 decades, the man who'd hidden in plain sight understood the ground beneath him was no longer solid. The bones had begun to speak. The days after that first interrogation settled over Dar el-Khair like a hell breath. The cafe stayed sealed behind yellow tape, windows dark, chairs stacked against the walls like mourners at a funeral. The people of the commune moved through their lives with lowered eyes and hushed voices, afraid to speak too loud about what had happened, afraid, almost, that the ground itself might be listening. But inside the offices of the judicial police, the silence wore a different shape. It was the silence of people working through the night, stitching together 30 years of lies, one document, one witness, one bone at a time. Detective Inspector Hassan El-Mansouri had turned his office into a war room. Photographs, maps, timelines covered the walls. Colored thread connected the names of the missing to the cafe, to land records, to the forged documents that had passed property from the dead to the living. At the center of it all, pinned above his desk, hung a photograph of said Berrada, calm, unreadable, staring out like a challenge. The inspector knew forensic evidence alone wouldn't break this case. He needed living witnesses, people who'd seen things, heard things, suspected things, and stayed quiet out of fear. In the small communities outside Casablanca, fear was a powerful muzzle. But fear could break, same as silence. It only took one person brave enough to speak first. That person arrived on a gray, windswept morning, hands trembling around a worn brown envelope clutched to her chest. Her name was Amina Benjaloun, early 40s, a widow with tired eyes and a face aged past its years. Wife of Khaled Benjaloun, Said's cousin, who had vanished without a trace 8 months earlier. They brought her into a small interview room, where El-Mansouri and a female officer waited. She sat slowly, set the envelope on the table, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she looked up, eyes red-rimmed, but steady. "I have something you need to see," she whispered. Inside the envelope, a document, several pages, carrying the official stamp of a notary in the Fida district. A power of attorney, dated the 12th of March, claiming Khaled Benjaloun had authorized his cousin Said to sell a house in the Merchich district and manage a plot of agricultural land belonging to Khaled's mother. The signature at the bottom was supposed to be his. Amina shook her head. "My husband never signed that. He was left-handed. This signature is too smooth, too clean. And the date, Khaled disappeared in January. How does a man sign a document in March?" A cold knot tightened in the inspector's stomach. He'd seen this pattern before: a missing person, a forged signature, a quiet transfer of property. The same pattern that had swallowed Qasim Berrada 3 decades earlier. He asked her to start from the beginning. She spoke low and unsteady, hands twisting a handkerchief in her lap. Khaled had been a quiet man, a mechanic, kept to himself. But over the past year, he'd grown consumed by the family's old land disputes, old letters, old contracts, and a notebook that had belonged to his father, one that mentioned Qasim's disappearance with open suspicion. Khaled had confronted Said about it at a family gathering in early January, accusing him outright of forgery and theft. Voices rose. Threats were made. Said denied everything, but something in his eyes had frightened Khaled. Weeks later, Said called, claiming he wanted to make peace. Invited Khaled to a warehouse near the old well. Khaled went reluctantly, hoping to settle it quietly. He never came home. Amina reported his disappearance, but with nothing to go on, the case stalled. Then in March, a nervous, evasive local clerk showed up at her door with the power of attorney, insisting Khaled had signed it before leaving town. She took the document, but never believed a word of it. She kept it hidden, terrified that pushing too hard would end her the same way it had ended her husband. But now, with the bones under the cafe, her voice broke. I knew I had to come. I knew if I didn't speak, the truth would stay buried forever. El Mansouri reached across the table, touched her hand gently. You did the right thing, he said. We will find your husband. After she left, the inspector sent the document to a handwriting expert in Casablanca. Preliminary results confirmed exactly what Amina had suspected: a crude imitation, inconsistent with Khaled's known hand. And the notary stamp belonged to a man named Mustafa Al-Fassi, a retired official in the FIDA district with a well-earned reputation for bending rules at the right price. El Mansouri drove out that afternoon into a narrow, crumbling street thick with the smell of exhaust and frying oil. He found Al-Fassi in a small, cluttered apartment, buried among stacks of yellowing paper and old filing boxes. Late 60s, bald, a thin gray mustache, the nervous eyes of a man who'd spent his life glancing over his shoulder. At first, denial. He had no memory of the documents. His files were a mess. Anyone could have stolen his stamp. But the moment El Mansouri said El Berrada's name, the old man's face drained of color. His hand started to shake. Said El Berrada. He repeated, like the name itself carried a curse. I haven't heard that name in years. Then why did you stamp his documents? Al-Fassi hesitated. Then, slowly, the story came. For over 20 years, Said had paid him to authenticate forged signatures. It started small, a single land transfer, a power of attorney. Over time, it became a business. Said brought the documents already signed. Al-Fassi stamped them without asking questions. He'd never known for certain what he was signing off on, but he'd suspected the names belonged to people who were dead or missing. He'd been too afraid and too greedy to stop. I didn't kill anyone, Al-Fassi whispered. I just signed papers. That's all. Just papers. El Mansouri recorded the confession and left. Driving back through the darkening streets, he felt the net closing. Between Amina's testimony and Al-Fassi's confession, they now had proof of a systematic forgery scheme tied to a string of disappearances. One piece was still missing, the location of the other bodies. And for that, they need to find the well where Khaled had vanished. That night, an anonymous tip reached the station. A resident of Dar el-Khair, refusing to give his name, said he'd seen said El Berrada walking toward the old well near the gendarmerie post at 2 a.m, carrying a shovel and a heavy bag. He'd been too frightened to report before. The news of the bones had changed that. The old well, known locally as Bir al-Haddad, had sat abandoned for years, half swallowed by wild fig trees and rubble at the edge of a dusty field. Less than 200 meters from the gendarmerie post, an irony that would haunt the investigators later. For months, while police searched for Khaled Benjaloun, his body had lain almost within sight of the station, sealed beneath the black water of a well everyone had forgotten. El Mansouri ordered a discreet surveillance operation. 3 nights, officers watching the well from among the trees. On the 4th night, said El Berrada appeared, alone, moving fast through the dark, face half hidden beneath a hood. He carried a rope and a crowbar. The officers watched him kneel at the well, lift the stone covering its mouth, and lean over the edge. The moment they'd been waiting for. But instead of lowering anything in, said simply stood there, motionless, staring into the black. His silhouette hung against the faint moonlight, breath rising like smoke in the cold air. 5 long minutes passed without a single movement. Then, slowly, he turned and walked away, vanishing into the shadows. The next morning, diverse and forensic experts arrived. They pumped out the stagnant water and descended into the narrow shaft. What waited at the bottom confirmed the investigation's darkest fears and pushed said El Berrada past the point of no return. Tangled in sludge and roots, a body, decomposed, bloated, but still recognizable by the clothes he'd last been seen in. A blue work shirt, dark trousers, worn leather sandals. Khaled Benjaloun, and his head, like the heads of so many victims before him, had been separated from his body. Pulling Khaled Benjaloun's body from that well was an operation that would stay with the men who carried it out for years to come. The shaft ran narrow, barely wide enough for one person to descend, its walls slick with black moss and decades of seepage. The water had been drained slowly, carefully, to preserve whatever lay beneath. When the first diver finally reached bottom, he found himself standing in thick, foul sludge that clung to his boots and filled his mask with a stench no amount of scrubbing would ever fully wash out. The body sat wedged against the stone wall, half buried under a layer of silt and small rocks that had fallen from above over the months. The position spoke of violence. Arms twisted at unnatural angles, legs splayed as if he'd been thrown rather than lowered. The head, separated from the torso, lay a short distance off, features bloated past recognition. But the blue work shirt was unmistakable. Amina Benjaloun had described it in exact detail when she filed the missing persons report, the shirt her husband wore the morning he left to meet his cousin. A forensic photographer documented the scene from every angle while the recovery team worked to secure the remains. Nearly 6 hours to bring the body to the surface. As the first pieces emerged, wrapped in white sheets and loaded carefully into waiting ambulances, a small crowd of neighbors gathered at the edge of the tape. Some wept openly. Others just stood in stunned silence, faces pale and hollow. Amina was there, notified by police, come to bear witness. She didn't scream, didn't collapse. She simply stood, eyes fixed on the white bundle that held her husband, and whispered something under her breath. A prayer, maybe, or a curse. Inspector El Mansouri watched from a distance, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. He'd seen terrible things across his career, but a widow identifying her husband's remains from a distance, not even permitted to touch him, carried a particular, quiet agony that stays with a man forever. He turned away, walked back to his car, and sat there a long while, gathering himself for what came next. The forensic report confirmed what everyone suspected: blunt force trauma to the head, the skull fractured in multiple places. The separation of head from body had happened after death, a result of decomposition and the pressure of the water. No defensive wounds on the hands or arms. He hadn't fought back. He'd trusted his killer enough to turn his back. The same day, the handwriting expert filed his full analysis of the forged power of attorney. The signature wasn't just inconsistent. It was a deliberate imitation, drawn slow and careful by someone who'd studied the victim's handwriting without ever fully grasping its natural rhythm. The expert flagged one telling error. The forger had written the letter Caf with a closed loop, while Khaled had always written it open. A small mistake, enough to prove the whole document a fraud. Meanwhile, the notary, Mustafa Al-Fassi, had started talking more freely under questioning. He admitted Said had brought him dozens of documents over the years: sale contracts, powers of attorney, inheritance claims, all carrying signatures Al-Fassi knew were forged. He'd never asked questions, just stamped, signed, collected his money. He named other suspected victims: a cemetery guard and his wife, Ahmed and Fatima Zuri, who'd vanished in the late 90s after a dispute with Said over a small plot of land near the cemetery, and a young waitress, Samira Kitani, who'd worked at Café Al Baraka and disappeared suddenly in 2008. Al-Fassi remembered her clearly. She'd come to him once, asking about a document Said wanted her to sign, something about a debt. She'd been frightened, wanted to know what it meant. He'd told her not to worry, just a formality. 2 weeks later, she was gone. Al-Fassi whispered. Never saw her again. But I knew. I always knew. The evidence was mounting, but the investigators still needed one thing: a confession. And for that, they'd have to sit Said El Berrada down with everything they had. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning, right in front of the cafe that had become the center of the whole investigation. Said stood outside talking to a supplier when 2 unmarked cars pulled up to the curb. 4 plainclothes officers stepped out and had him surrounded before he could react. He didn't run, didn't fight. He just looked at them with an expression closer to relief than fear, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for a very long time. They took him not to the local post in Mediona, but to the central station in Casablanca. Larger, colder, gray walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, a video camera in the corner blinking its steady red light. They searched him, fingerprinted him, cuffed his hands to the table. He asked for water. An officer brought a plastic cup. He drank slowly, eyes fixed on the door. When Inspector El Mansouri entered, he carried 3 thick folders under his arm. He set them down one by one, in a neat row, and said nothing at first, just stood there, looking at the man across from him. The man who'd killed his own uncle. His cousin, a tenant, a guard and the guard's wife, a waitress, the man who'd served tea to his neighbors for decades while the dead lay beneath his feet. "Do you know why you're here?" El Mansuri asked finally. Said met his eyes. "I have done nothing wrong." The inspector sat, opened the first folder. Crime scene photographs of the bones under the cafe. The DNA results identifying Qasim El Berrada. The forged sale contract, Al-Fassi's confession. The second folder, recovery photographs from the well, the power of attorney, the handwriting analysis. The third, statements from Amina bin Jalaun, from Al-Fassi, from the anonymous caller who'd watched Said return to the well at night. For a long time, Said said nothing. He stared at the photographs and documents like they were written in a language he didn't recognize. His face, always so carefully controlled, began to twitch at the corners. His breathing slowed, deepened. His cuffed hands clenched into fists. El Mansuri leaned forward. "The evidence is overwhelming, Mr. El Berrada. We have your uncle's body, your cousin's body, the forged documents, a notary ready to testify against you. The only thing we don't have is the reason. Why did you do it? For land? For money? Or simply because you could?" Said's jaw tightened. He looked away toward the bare gray wall, seeming almost to shrink into himself. When he finally spoke, his voice came low and hoarse. "I had no choice," he said. The words hung there. Not yet a full confession, but the first crack in the dam. The first sign that the man across the table wasn't an innocent caught in circumstance, but someone who had made terrible choices and lived inside them for 30 years. El Mansuri didn't push. He waited. Said drew a long breath, chest rising and falling under his thin shirt. When he looked up again, something like emotion had entered his eyes. Not remorse, not sorrow, but exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who'd carried a mountain of secrets for 3 decades and was finally being asked to set it down. "My uncle was going to take the land," said slowly. "Sell it. Give the money to his sons. My father had died. My mother was sick. I had nothing. Nothing. And he had everything. The land, the house, the money. He was going to leave me with nothing." His voice cracked. "So I killed him. I didn't plan it. It just happened. We argued, and I hit him, and then I kept hitting him. And when it was over, I knew I couldn't stop. Because if I stopped, they'd find out, and they'd take everything from me." El Mansuri listened, face impassive. In his notebook, he wrote a single word, beginning. Outside, rain began drumming again against the station windows. Casablanca, with its millions of souls, went about its business, unaware that in a small gray room, a man had finally started telling the truth about 30 years of murder. The story was far from over. More bodies to find, more secrets to unearth, more horrors to confront. But the silence had broken. And once silence breaks, the dead can finally start to rest. The interrogation room had gone cold. The fluorescent light above the metal table flickered once, twice, then settled into a steady, sickly glow. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a silence that pressed against the walls like something alive. Said El Berrada sat with his hands cuffed to the table, shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on a point somewhere between the folders and the gray floor. The first confession, his uncle's murder, hung in the air, a wound finally torn open after 30 years of silence. Detective Inspector Hassan El-Mansouri didn't rush him. He'd learned long ago that in moments like this, silence was the sharpest tool in the room. He let the seconds stretch, watching the man across from him breathe, watching the tremor in his fingers, the way his jaw clenched and unclenched as if chewing on words he'd never once spoken aloud. After a long pause, the inspector opened the second folder and drew out a photograph. The crime scene image from the well, Khaled Benjeloun's body being lifted in a white sheet, the outline of his severed head visible beneath the fabric. He set it on the table, facing Said. "Tell me about Khaled," El-Mansouri said quietly. "Your cousin, the man who confronted you about the land, the man whose wife you handed a forged power of attorney." Said's eyes flicked to the photograph, then away. He swallowed hard, the muscles of his throat working against his collar. For a moment, it looked like he'd deny it all over again. Then his shoulders sagged, and he let out a breath that sounded like the last air escaping a punctured tire. "He was going to ruin me," said, barely above a whisper. "He found the old papers, the letters from my uncle's sons, started asking questions. The notary, the neighbors, wanted to reopen the land case. Said he'd go to the police if I didn't return the property." The inspector nodded slowly. "So you killed him?" "I didn't want to." His voice cracked. "I called him to the warehouse near the well. Told him I wanted to settle things, give him a share of the money. He believed me. Came alone, like a fool. A bitter laugh, hollow and ugly. He trusted me. That was his mistake." "What happened then?" Said's eyes went distant, as though watching the scene replay against the gray wall behind the inspector. "We argued. I offered him a small amount, enough to keep quiet. He refused. Said he wanted the truth. Said he knew what I'd done to my uncle, and he'd make sure everyone knew. He turned his back to leave, and I picked up a rock, heavy one, off the ground near the well. Hit him from behind. He fell, and I kept hitting him. I don't know how many times. When I stopped, his head it wasn't head anymore. The room went silent. The fluorescent light buzzed. El-Mansouri wrote in his notebook, blunt force trauma, repeated blows, body disposed in well. Then you threw him in the well, the inspector said. Not a question. Said nodded. Dragged him to the edge and pushed him in. He was heavy. Thought the water would cover him. Put a stone over the mouth so no one would look inside. The same well 200 meters from the gendarmerie post. Another bitter smile. Yes, the irony wasn't lost on me. Walked past that well every day, knowing he was down there. But no one ever checked. El-Mansouri leaned back, studying him. The confession was flowing easier now, each admission loosening the next. He decided to push further. What about the others? He asked. The tenant who wouldn't leave. The cemetery guard and his wife. The waitress. Tell me about them. Said's hands tightened at the edge of the table. For a moment he seemed to fold inward, as if the weight of so many deaths had settled directly onto his chest. But the dam had already broken, and the words kept coming now, slow and relentless, like water finding cracks in stone. The tenant, he said, had been a man named Abdul Karim El Gwamusi. Sold fava beans from a cart near the old market. Rented a house that belonged to Said's family. When Said tried to evict him, Abdul Karim refused, insisting the house had been promised to him by Said's father. The dispute dragged on for months, each round more heated than the last. One night, Said went to the house pretending to negotiate. Instead, he strangled the man in his own kitchen, wrapped the body in a blanket, drove it hours away to a remote field, and buried it under a pile of stones. He was a stubborn old fool, said flatly. Should have left when I told him to. The cemetery guard and his wife were a different story. Ahmed Zuri and his wife Fatima had worked the local cemetery for years, tending graves, keeping the grounds. They'd seen something, Said never specified what, and tried blackmailing him for it. He'd paid them once, twice, 3 times, but they kept coming back for more. Finally, he went to their small house near the cemetery one night, carrying a knife, cut both their throats, one after the other, and left them where they fell. Returned the next day to bury them in a shallow grave behind the cemetery wall. I didn't want to kill them, he said, something close to pleading in his voice. But they wouldn't stop. Thought I was weak because I paid. Thought I'd keep paying forever. El-Man Suri's jaw tightened, and the waitress. At the mention of her, Said's composure finally cracked. His eyes went wet. He looked away, staring at the wall as if searching for an exit that wasn't there. Samira, he whispered. Her name was Samira. Samira Kitani had been 22 when she started working at Café, Berrada. Pretty quick-witted, curious, too curious. She found something in the back room one day. A loose floorboard, a smell that wouldn't leave. She'd asked Said about it. He'd brush her off. She kept asking. Went to the notary, asked about documents, about the tar, about the strange comings and goings at night. She'd known too much, or gotten close enough to knowing. She was a good worker, said, voice thickening, but she didn't know when to stop. Came to me one night, said she wanted money or she'd go to the police. I told her I'd pay her, told her to meet me at the cafe after closing. He swallowed hard. I strangled her too. Same kitchen where she used to make tea for the customers. Buried her under the floor next to my uncle. The inspector's pen stopped moving. He looked up from the notebook, eyes hard and cold. How many more, Said? How many people did you kill? Said shook his head slowly, as if the number itself were too heavy to hold. I don't know. I lost count. There were others over the years. People who got in my way. People who asked too many questions. I buried them all. Under the cafe. In the well. In the fields. Used the tar to cover the smell. Poured it over the graves. Again and again. Until no one could smell anything but tar. For the first time, something like horror crept into his voice. Not horror what he'd done, but at the sheer scale of it, as if only now was he grasping the full weight of his own crimes. He'd killed for land, for money, for silence, for convenience. Killed his own blood, his own employees, his own neighbors. Done it so often, so methodically, that it had become almost ordinary, a routine part of his life, like brewing tea or sweeping the floor. The inspector closed the folders and stood, looked down at Said, visibly shaking now, face pale and slick with sweat. The confession would need verifying, of course, more bodies to find, more graves, more forgotten victims. But the truth was out. The man who'd hidden in plain sight for 30 years had just admitted to being a serial killer. "You will show us where the bodies are," El Mansouri said. "Not a request." Said nodded, head hanging low. "Yes, I'll show you. I'll show you everything." As the inspector left, he paused in the doorway and looked back. Said El Berrada still sat at the table, hands cuffed, head bowed, looking every bit like a man who'd just woken from a nightmare and realized it was real. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to creep over the rooftops of Casablanca, pale and gray, like the edge of a wound. The confession was the beginning of the end, but the end would be a long, slow descent into the darkness Said had built. A darkness filled with more graves, more bones, more stories of lives cut short by a man who'd worn the mask of respectability for 30 years. And as the city stirred awake, the investigators prepared to follow him into it, one shovel of earth at a time. The first light of dawn found Inspector Hassan El Mansouri standing outside the central station in Casablanca, breath fogging in the cold air, hands wrapped around a paper cup of black coffee. The city was waking slowly, streets still wet from the night's rain, the smell of diesel and damp concrete rising off the pavement. In the underground garage, a convoy of police vehicles was being readied. 3 four-wheel drives, a forensic van, a black sedan with tinted windows. Inside that sedan said El Berrada, cuffed between 2 uniformed officers, head resting against the cold glass, eyes closed. He had slept, or pretended to. His face had gone gray, stubble dark against pale skin. He still wore the white shirt from the day before, now rumpled and stained with sweat. A thin chain ran from his wrist cuffs to a ring bolted to the floor, clinking softly every time he shifted. He'd agreed to show them where the bodies were. All of them, or so he said. The convoy pulled out of the garage at exactly 7:15, moving through the waking city like an unmarked funeral procession. At the front, a police van cleared the way, blue lights strobing against wet streets. Behind it, the sedan carrying Said, then the forensic van, then 2 patrol cars trailing. They passed through the industrial outskirts, auto repair shops, empty lots, half-built apartment blocks rising like broken teeth against the gray sky. The road to Dar el-Khair ran narrow and potholed, lined with eucalyptus trees whose leaves hung limp and heavy in the damp air. First stop, the Café. The yellow tape still fluttered in the morning breeze. A single police guard posted at the door, rifle slung over his shoulder. The forensic team had already cleared the main pit, but Said had claimed more remains sat beneath the back storage room, under a section of floor covered by a metal shelving unit, a section they'd left untouched, waiting on his word to guide them. They led him from the sedan, his steps slow and stiff, a limp dragging at one leg. Exhaustion, or the weight of his crimes, no one could say which. He pointed with his cuffed hands toward the rear of the building, and the team followed him inside. The air sat stale, thick with old tar and damp earth. Portable lights cut through the shadows. The floor had already been grit off in spray paint. In the far corner, beneath a sagging metal shelf, Said stopped. "There," he said, voice hollow, "under the corner. I laid the floor over it in 1995. The forensic team got to work, moved the shelf, pried up the loose tiles, broke through the concrete with electric jackhammers. The noise deafening in that small space, echoing off the walls like gunfire. Dust rose in clouds. Officers coughed behind their masks. After an hour, they'd open a hole roughly 2 meters square. The smell that rose out of it hit immediate and terrible, sweet, cloying, cutting straight through the dust and forcing even the hardened investigators back a step. One of the forensic officers, a young woman named Dr. Layla Amrani, knelt at the edge and shone her flashlight in. The beam caught a tangle of bones, coated in a dark, sticky substance gleaming under the light. Tar. Again. The remains lay jumbled together, as if thrown in without care, one body over another. She counted at least 2 skulls, maybe 3. "How many are here?" said. El Mansouri asked quietly. Said shrugged. 3, maybe 4. I don't remember. The waitress, a man who owed me money, another one, a cousin of my wife. Buried them all here. The inspector turned to the team. Document everything. We'll need to identify each one. The search stretched through the day. From the cafe, the convoy moved to the field where said claimed to have buried the tenant, Abdul Karim El Gwamusi, a desolate stretch near the old market, overgrown with dry weeds and littered with construction debris. Said led them to a spot near a pile of broken concrete blocks, ground slightly sunken. The team dug carefully with shovels and trowels, and within 2 hours uncovered a shallow grave. The body lay wrapped in a brown blanket, rotted and torn now, bones visible through the fabric, skull fractured, jaw hanging open as if frozen mid-scream. A small crowd gathered at the field's edge, held back by police tape. Among them stood the sons of Abdul Karim El Gwamusi, grown men now, who'd spent decades wondering what happened to their father. When the body came up out of the grave, one of them let out a low, keening cry that seemed to rise from somewhere deep in his chest. He tried pushing past the officers. They held him back, and he sank to his knees in the dirt, sobbing. Said watch from inside the sedan, face blank. If he felt anything, remorse, fear, satisfaction, none of it showed. He'd become a spectator to his own atrocities, a man who'd buried so many bodies he could no longer keep them straight in his memory. The next stop was the cemetery, a small, walled compound on the edge of Dar el-Khair, old and overgrown, crooked headstones scattered among patches of wild thyme. Said directed them to the back wall, where a section of ground had been disturbed years ago and never properly retamped. The forensic team gridded off and began to dig. The soil sat loose and sandy, and within an hour they'd uncovered 2 skeletons lying side by side, hands still positioned as if warding off the blows that killed them. The skulls carried deep cut marks, the work of a knife. Ahmed and Fatima Zuri, the cemetery guard and his wife, had finally been found. By late afternoon, the convoy returned to the station. The evidence lockers filled steadily with bags of bone, fragments of clothing, samples of tar. The forensic team would need weeks, maybe months, to identify every victim, to match DNA, to reconstruct a full timeline of death. But the pattern was already unmistakable. For 30 years, said El Berrada had used the same methods: forged documents, quiet disappearances, burial sites ranging from his own cafe floor to forgotten wells and shallow graves. He'd killed at least 8 people, possibly more. The true number might never be known. That evening, as the sun set over Casablanca in streaks of orange and purple, Inspector El Mansouri sat alone in his office, staring at the wall of evidence. The faces of the dead looked back: Qasim, Khaled, Abdul Karim, Ahmed, Fatima, Samira, and others whose names remained unknown. A preliminary report sat on his desk from the prosecutor's office, recommending formal charges of premeditated murder, kidnapping, forgery, and concealment of corpses. The death penalty, rarely carried out in Morocco these days, but still on the books, was something the prosecutor intended to push for. But El Mansouri didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired, hollowed out under the weight of so much suffering. He thought of Amina Benjaloun, standing at the edge of the well, whispering her prayer, of the sons of the tenant, on their knees in the dirt, of everyone in Dar el-Khair who'd sat drinking tea at Café, al-Baraka, laughing, arguing, living their small lives, while beneath them, the dead lay in silence the whole time. The case would go to trial in the coming months. The testimony would run long and harrowing. The public would be shocked, horrified, fascinated, all three at once. And in the end, justice, whatever that word really meant, would be served. But the scars would stay, carved deep into the community, into the families, into the very earth of that small, forgotten corner of Morocco. The bones had spoken, and what they said was a story of betrayal so complete it defied understanding. As the inspector switched off his desk lamp and walked out into the night, the first stars appeared over the city. The rain had stopped. The air had gone cool and clean. Somewhere out there in the dark, the cafe sat empty and silent, its floors torn open, its secrets laid bare. The man who'd owned it was behind bars now, his confession echoing through the corridors of the station. And the dead, at last, were being brought into the light. The investigation was far from finished. More bodies to find, more stories to tell, more questions still waiting on answers. But the end was in sight now, and it was coming fast, like a train in the night, carrying the full weight of 3 decades of murder. In the weeks after the bodies were recovered, the investigation shifted from the graves to the paper trail. The forgery network that had let said El Berrada steal land and silence his victims wasn't the work of one man alone. It was a small, quiet conspiracy of greed and cowardice spread across the bureaucratic underbelly of Casablanca. Detective Inspector Hassan El Mansouri had already pulled in the notary, Mustafa Al-Fassi, whose confession had cracked open the wider scheme. But Al-Fassi was only one gear in a machine that had been turning for decades, stamping its approval on the deaths of the vanished. The second gear was a mechanic named Youssef El Amrani, wiry, early 50s, grease-stained hands, a nervous twitch in his left eye. His workshop sat at the edge of the old industrial zone, a cluttered yard of rusted car parts and gutted vehicles. On the surface, just another small businessman. Underneath the oil and grime, a side trade, forging documents, bills of sale, powers of attorney, inheritance claims, any signature that wasn't his own. Said it found him years back through a cousin who knew a cousin, and the arrangement stayed simple ever since. Said brought the names, the property details, the money. Youssef produced the paperwork. When police raided his shop on a damp Thursday morning, they found stacks of blank notary stamps, bottles of ink in different shades, a drawer full of practice signatures. Youssef tried to run. An officer caught him by the collar in the back alley and wrestled him to the ground. He cried as they cuffed him, tears of self-pity more than remorse, wailing that he'd only done what he was told, that he had a family, that he wasn't a killer. But the documents told a different story. He'd signed a forged power of attorney for Khaled Benjelloun, drafted the fake sale contract for Qasim el-Berrada's land. He'd been a silent partner in murder, turning stolen lives into clean lines of ink. The third man was a low-level clerk in the Fida district municipality, Rashid Benani, the one who filed the documents, entered them into the official record, looked the other way when signatures didn't match. Soft-spoken, thick glasses, the resigned air of a man who'd long ago stopped caring about right and wrong. He'd taken bribes from Said for over a decade, small at first, then larger, until he was in too deep to refuse. When investigators came for him, he didn't resist, just closed his ledger, took off his glasses, and said, "I knew this day would come." The arrest of the three accomplices sent a shockwave through the local administration. Rumors spread of other officials, other notaries, other clerks who might be involved. An internal investigation launched. Several lower-level employees found themselves suspended pending review. The scandal wasn't just about murder anymore. It was about the rot that had let murder flourish, the quiet corruption that had turned government offices into laundries for blood-stained land deeds. While the legal machinery ground forward, El Mansouri turned his attention to the mind behind it all. He requested a psychological evaluation of Said el-Berrada, conducted by a forensic psychiatrist named Dr. Nadia Krabi, a respected name in criminal behavior, calm-eyed, with a voice that could pry open even the most guarded soul. She met with Said 6 times over the course of a month, in a small, windowless room at the prison holding him. What she found was chilling in its banality. Said el-Berrada wasn't insane, not by any legal definition. He knew exactly what he'd done and knew it was wrong. But he'd built himself a worldview where his actions weren't crimes so much as necessities. Survival, he called it. He believed the world split cleanly into those who took and those who got taken from. And he'd long ago decided which side he'd rather stand on. His uncle's land, his cousin's property, the tenant's stubbornness, the guard's blackmail, all of it registered to him as threats to his own existence. So he removed them, one by one, with the cold logic of a man who saw other people as obstacles rather than as people. He does not feel guilt in the way you or I would understand it, Dr. Krabi wrote in her report. He feels regret, perhaps, but it is the regret of a man who has been caught, not of a man who has sinned. His emotional range is shallow, his empathy nearly absent. The psychiatrist also traced the shape of a childhood built from loss and resentment. His father had died young, leaving the family dependent on relatives' charity. His uncle Qasim, wealthy, controlling, dismissive of the boy. The land, the property, the status, all of it dangled just out of reach, and young Said had burned with a quiet fury that never really faded. When he finally killed his uncle, it wasn't a moment of madness. It was the endpoint of years of simmering rage. And after the first kill, the second came easier. The third, easier still. Killing became a tool, a way of solving problems other people handled with lawyers or arguments, or simply by walking away. Said Berrada had never learned how to walk away. The report made for grim reading. It confirmed what the investigators had already suspected. The man in custody wasn't a tormented soul, but a predator, one who'd killed without passion and buried his victims without ceremony. His confession, though detailed, had come out in the same flat tone he used to order tea. He described strangling a young waitress the way another man might describe changing the oil in his car. No moral compass at work, only a compass of self-interest. As the trial date approached, the prosecution built its case. The charges stacked up: premeditated murder, kidnapping, forgery of official documents, concealment of corpses, fraud. The prosecutor, a stern woman named Khadija El-Fassi, was known for her relentless preparation and her quiet, devastating cross-examinations. She'd been waiting for a case like this, one that would expose the dark underbelly of Casablanca's land wars and hold a monster accountable for 30 years of terror. She worked late into the night, organizing witness statements, forensic reports, tape confessions. On her office wall, a timeline of the killings stretched from 1981 to 2012, victims' names written in red ink. The defense, meanwhile, was scrambling. Said had initially refused a lawyer, insisting he had no need for one, but the court appointed him one anyway. A young attorney named Omar Tatsi, saddled with the unenviable task of defending a client whose own confession was already on video. Tatsi's strategy, such as it was, would argue coercion behind the confession, inconclusive forensics, and a client shaped into violence by the greed of others. A weak defense, but it was all he had. The trial's first day was set for the third week of November. The courthouse in Casablanca stood imposing and stone-faced, its columns streaked with decades of soot and rain. Word had spread through the media, and reporters from across the country began descending on the city, eager to cover the trial of the man the papers had started calling the Café killer. The public followed with a mix of horror and fascination. Back in Dar el-Khair, the Café sat closed, doors chained, windows boarded. The neighbors spoke in whispers, afraid to say too much, but their eyes carried a deep, lingering fear. For 30 years they'd lived beside a monster and never known it. The question that haunted them wasn't just how, it was why. Why had no one suspected? No one questioned. No one stopped it long before it reached this terrible peak. The answer, perhaps, lived somewhere in the fabric of the community itself, in the reluctance to pry into other people's business, in the respect paid to property and status, in the quiet complicity of anyone who'd seen a forged document and chosen not to look too closely. The bones under the Café hadn't just been hidden by tar and concrete. They'd been hidden by a culture of silence that protected men like Said Berrada, right up until it couldn't anymore. As the trial neared, El Mansouri spent his evenings alone in his office, staring at the wall of evidence. He thought about the victims, about their families, about the long, slow road that had led everyone to this moment. He thought about Samira Kitani, 22 years old and full of curiosity, who'd paid for that curiosity with her life. About the cemetery guard and his wife, whose only crime was knowing too much. About Qasim el-Berrada, whose land had become his death warrant. And he thought about the question everyone would be asking in the days ahead. How does a man kill for 30 years and never get caught? The answer wasn't simple. It involved forged papers, bribed officials, terrified witnesses, and the terrible power of familiar face. But in the end, the bones had spoken. They'd waited patiently under that cafe floor, sealed in tar and darkness, until the day a blocked drain and a curious laborer finally called them back into the light. The trial was coming, and with it a reckoning. But the scars would remain long after the verdict was read, carved into the earth of Dar el-Khair, into the hearts of everyone who'd lived through the nightmare. The man in the dock would answer for his crimes, but the dead would never come home, and the silence that had protected him for so long would linger for generations. The courthouse in Casablanca rose from the old city like a monument to the law's slow, grinding power. Its stone facade carried decades of rain and exhaust in dark streaks, columns chipped and darkened with time. On the morning of the trial, a cold wind blew in off the Atlantic, carrying salt and diesel under a flat, unforgiving gray sky. The streets outside were already crowded. Reporters, photographers, curious onlookers, all come to catch a glimpse of the man the newspapers had taken to calling the Café killer. Inside, the main courtroom sat packed. Journalists filled the back benches, notebooks balanced on their knees, camera crews jostling for position in the gallery above. The victims' families occupied the front rows, faces tight with grief and expectation. Amina Benjaloun sat there in black, hands clasped tight in her lap. Beside her, the sons of the tenant, Abdul Karim El Goumoussi, grown men now, carrying their father's stubborn jaw and their mother's quiet dignity. Further down, relatives of the cemetery guard and his wife murmured prayers under their breath, fingers working through strands of prayer beads. And tucked in a far corner, almost swallowed by shadow, sat an elderly woman who'd come alone, the aunt of Samira Kitani, the young waitress whose curiosity had cost her everything. The defendant was brought in through a side door, flanked by two guards in dark uniforms. Said el-Berrada had changed. The confident, almost serene man who'd once sat calmly across from Inspector El-Mansouri was gone. In his place stood a hollowed-out figure, stooped shoulders, gray and sunken face. He wore a plain gray prison uniform, hands cuffed in front of him, the chain clinking softly with every step. He didn't look at the families, didn't look at the judge, kept his eyes on the floor, as if 30 years had finally pressed him flat into the ground. The presiding judge, Abdelkader Benchikroun, was a veteran of the criminal courts known for fairness and a low tolerance for theatrics. He took the high bench, black robe draped over his shoulders, reading glasses perched at the end of his nose. Prosecutor Khadija El Fassi stood at her table, notes stacked neatly, expression calm but focused. Across from her, defense attorney Omar Tatsi looked young and outmatched, shuffling through his papers with nervous energy. The clerk read the charges in a flat, monotonous voice. Premeditated murder, kidnapping, forgery of official documents, concealment of corpses, fraud. The list went on. Each charge another stone laid on the grave of the accused's former life. When the clerk finished, the judge turned to the defendant. "How do you plead?" Judge Benchacrown asked. Said didn't look up. His voice, when it came, was barely audible. "Not guilty." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The family stiffened. Amina Benjaloun closed her eyes, as if the words had landed like a physical blow. Not guilty. After the confessions, after the bodies, after bones pulled straight from the earth, not guilty. The prosecutor rose to deliver her opening statement. No theatrics, no raised voice, just facts, laid out one by one with a surgeon's precision. She walked the court through the discovery of the bones under the café, the tar poured over the graves, the DNA match identifying Berrada, the body in the well, the severed head, the forged power of attorney, the other graves, the other victims, the pattern stretching back to 1981. Then she turned to face the defendant directly, her eyes cold and unblinking. "This man," she said, "did not kill in a moment of passion. He killed with patience, with planning, with a coldness that defies comprehension. He killed his own family. He killed his neighbors. He killed a young woman who worked for him. And he did it all while serving tea to the community, while shaking hands with the bereaved, while pretending to be a good and decent man. The evidence will show that he is not a man, but a monster who wore the mask of respectability for 30 years. The defense attorney's opening ran shorter and far less confident. He spoke of the presumption of innocence, the possibility of a coerced confession, the unreliability of forensic evidence. He asked the jury to keep an open mind, to remember where the burden of proof lay. But the words rang hollow even as he said them, and he seemed to know it. Said sat motionless beside him, head bowed, eyes closed. The first witness was the forensic pathologist, Dr. Salma Benuna. She took the stand with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent her career speaking for the dead. She walked through the excavation at the cafe in detail, the layers of concrete and tile, the black tar poured over the graves, the position of the bodies. She explained the DNA identification of Berrada, the fracture patterns pointing to repeated blunt force trauma. She described the body in the well, the severed head, the advanced decomposition. Precise, clinical, devastating. When the prosecutor asked whether the remains could have been placed there by someone other than the owner, Dr. Benuna's answer landed simply. The building was owned and operated by the defendant for over 20 years. The tar used to seal the graves was found in his storage room. His fingerprints were on the barrels. The evidence points overwhelmingly to one person. The defense tried to push back, suggesting the tar might have been left by a previous tenant, the fingerprints possibly contaminated. Dr. Benuna didn't waver. Her testimony stood like a wall, and the defense's questions broke against it like waves against stone. The second witness was Amina Benjaloun. She walked to the stand with her head high, black dress rustling softly. The prosecutor walked her through her husband's disappearance, the confrontation with said, the forged power of attorney that arrived in March, months after Khaled vanished. Her voice trembled at points, but she didn't cry. She'd cried enough already, she said. Now she wanted justice. When the defense attorney rose to cross-examine, he tried suggesting her husband had simply left, that the marriage had troubles, that the power of attorney might have been genuine. Amina looked at him with such fierce, wounded dignity that he faltered mid-question. My husband was a good man, she said quietly. He would never have left without telling me. He would never have signed that paper. And he would never have left his children without a father. The man who did this is sitting right there. She pointed at Said, and for the first time since the trial began, the defendant lifted his head and met her eyes. The courtroom held its breath. For a long, terrible moment, the widow and the killer stared at each other, and then Said looked away. The trial would run for weeks, witness after witness taking the stand, the forensic anthropologist, the handwriting expert, the notary, the mechanic, the clerk. The prosecution built its case like a mason laying a wall, stone by stone, until the truth felt unassailable. The defense fought back with objections and technicalities, but the weight of the evidence kept crushing forward. And through it all, Said Berrada sat in the dock, a silent, shrunken figure, his face a mask of exhaustion and something that might have been resignation. Outside, Casablanca went on with its business, the trial fading into the background noise of daily life. But inside the courthouse, the dead were finally getting their day. Their bones, their stories, their stolen lives, all of it laid bare for the world to see. And the man who'd buried them was running out of places left to hide. The second week of the trial brought a shift in the air. The initial shock that had gripped the courtroom on opening day had settled into something grimmer, more mechanical. Witness after witness, exhibit after exhibit, each one another stone laid onto the wall of evidence against Said Berrada. But on the morning the accomplices were scheduled to testify, a different tension moved through the room. The sense that the trial was about to cross a threshold with no way back. Even the journalists in the gallery, usually so jaded, leaned forward in their seats, pens poised, cameras rolling. The first accomplice to take the stand was Mustafa Al-Fassi, the former notary. He shuffled to the witness box in a rumpled gray suit, bald head gleaming under the courtroom lights, looking older than his 68 years, face deeply lined, eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. When the clerk administered the oath, his voice cracked, and he had to clear his throat twice before he could speak. Prosecutor Khadija Al-Fassi, no relation, approached slowly, heels clicking against the marble floor, careful not to crowd him, though her presence filled the space regardless. Mr. Al-Fassi, she began, you have already confessed to your role in the forgery scheme. Is that correct? Yes, he whispered. Tell the court, please, how you first met the defendant, said Berrada. Al-Fassi swallowed hard. His eyes flicked to Said, motionless in the dock, then back to the prosecutor. Early 90s. I had a small office in the FIDA district. Handle notarizations, contracts, powers of attorney, inheritance papers. He came in one day with a land sale document. Said the seller, his uncle, had moved to Algeria, couldn't sign in person, had a signature already on the paper, asked me to notarize it. And did you? I did. Asked no questions. He paid me twice the usual fee. Did you know the signature was forged? A long pause. Al-Fassi's hands trembled against the edge of the witness box. I suspected, but I told myself it wasn't my business. Just stamped the paper and sent him away. And after that first time, did he return? Many times. Over the years. Every few months at first, then more often. He'd bring documents already signed. Powers of attorney, sale contracts, inheritance claims. Said the signatories were relatives who were away, or tenants who owed him money, or people who'd sold him property. I knew some of those people, knew some of them had disappeared. He paused, voice dropping, but I never asked, just stamped and collected my money. The prosecutor walked to the evidence table, picked up a document sealed in a clear plastic sleeve, the forged power of attorney for Khaled Benjelloun. She showed it to Al-Fassi. Is this one of the documents you notarized? He squinted, then nodded. Yes, I remember it. The defendant brought it in March of last year. Said his cousin had signed it before leaving town. Did you believe him? Al-Fassi's face crumpled. No, but I was afraid. He had a way of looking at you. Like he knew everything about you. Like he could destroy you if you refused. So I stamped it. Didn't ask where Khaled Benjelloun was. The defense attorney rose to cross-examine, trying to paint Al-Fassi as a liar shifting blame to save himself, pointing out he'd been promised a reduced sentence for his testimony. But the old notary's voice held steady, carrying a kind of exhausted honesty. I am guilty, he said. I helped the killer. I don't deny it. But I didn't know how many, not until the bones were found. And when I found out, I wanted to die. The mechanic, Youssef El Amrani, testified next. More volatile, eyes red and swollen, hands picking at the seams of his prison uniform. He broke down almost the moment he took the stand, sobbing that he'd never hurt anyone, that he'd only drawn up papers, that he had a wife and 4 children. The prosecutor let him cry a moment, then asked quietly, Mr. El Amrani, did you forge the signature of Qasim El Berrada on a land sale contract in 1981? He wiped his nose with the back of his hand. Yes, he choked out, but I didn't know who it was. Told me it was a relative who owed him money. Just copied the signature from an old letter he gave me. Didn't ask. And did you forge the power of attorney for Khaled Benjelloun, dated 3 months after he disappeared? Yes, barely a whisper, but I didn't know he was dead. Thought maybe he'd left, gone to another city. Told me he was traveling. I believed him. Wanted to believe him. The clerk, Rashid Benani, testified last, calm, almost detached, as if the whole trial were happening to someone else. He admitted to processing the fraudulent documents for years, filing them into the official record without question. He'd accepted bribes for over a decade, small at first, then larger. Asked why, he shrugged. I was a small man with a small salary. He offered me money, and I took it. It was wrong, but I didn't think it would lead to this. Didn't think he was killing people. Thought it was just land disputes, family squabbles. I didn't know. The prosecutor's final question was simple. Do you regret it? Rashid Benani looked out at the families in the front row, the widow, the sons, the elderly aunt. For the first time, his composure cracked. Every day, he said. Every single day. Then came the moment everyone had been bracing for. The prosecutor called for admission of the recorded confession. The courtroom lights dimmed as a large screen was wheeled in and positioned at the front of the room. The clerk announced the prosecution would play the video of said Berrada's confession, recorded at the central station the night of his arrest. Grainy footage, colors washed pale under the fluorescent lights of the interrogation room. But the voice came through clear. Said sat at the metal table, hands cuffed, face pale and tired. And then, in that flat, hoarse voice, he began to speak. I killed my uncle. I killed my cousin. I killed the tenant. I killed the guard and his wife. I killed the waitress. The words hung in the courtroom like a verdict already pronounced. The family sat rigid, faces drained white. Amina Benjaloun turned away, pressing a handkerchief to her mouth. The sons of the tenant stared straight ahead, jaws clenched. The elderly aunt of Samira Kitani began to weep silently, her thin shoulders shaking. On screen, Said kept going, describing the murders in that same matter-of-fact tone, as if reading off a shopping list. The court sat in silence, the only sounds the soft hiss of the speakers and the distant hum of traffic outside. When the video ended, the lights came back up, and the room seemed to exhale all at once. Said, in the dock, hadn't looked at the screen once. He'd kept his head bowed, eyes closed, as if the sound of his own voice confessing was more than he could bear. When the prosecutor asked if he had anything to say, he only shook his head. The judge called a recess. The courtroom emptied slowly, families lingering, reporters rushing to file their stories. In the corridor outside, the families of the dead gathered in small, hushed clusters, grief no longer fresh but scraped raw again by the sound of those words. The trial wasn't over. The defense would still get its turn, and the defendant might yet speak in his own defense. But for those who'd waited 30 years for justice, that confession playing out in open court felt like the first crack of light after a long, dark night. The monster had spoken, and everyone had heard him. The final days of the trial arrived with a heaviness that seemed to settle over the courtroom like dust. The public gallery ran fuller than ever, wooden benches creaking under the weight of spectators who'd come to witness the end of something that had begun 30 years earlier. The victims' families still sat in their usual places, but something in their faces had shifted. The raw grief of the early days had hardened into something else, a grim, exhausted determination. They'd waited too long for this moment to turn away now. Defense attorney Omar Tatsi rose to deliver his closing argument on a gray afternoon, his young face pale under the courtroom lights. He looked tired, suit rumpled, voice strained. He opened by acknowledging the horror of the crimes. He couldn't deny them, and didn't try. But he asked the court to weigh the circumstances, the pressures, the years of family conflict and hardship that had shaped his client. Justice is not only about punishment, Tatsi said, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. It is about understanding. My client is not a monster. He is a man who was shaped by loss, by resentment, by a society that turned its back on him. That does not excuse what he did, but it must inform how we judge him. He is not without remorse. He is not without humanity. Prosecutor Khadija El Fassi rose slowly. She didn't raise her voice. Didn't need to. She walked to the center of the courtroom and turned to face the judge, the jury, the packed gallery. Remorse, she repeated, as if tasting the word. The defense asks us to consider the defendant's remorse. But where was that remorse when he strangled a 22-year-old waitress in the kitchen of his cafe? Where was that remorse when he cut the throats of a cemetery guard and his wife in their own home? Where was that remorse when he pushed his own cousin's body into a well and covered it with stones? Where was that remorse during the 30 years he spent serving tea to the families of the people he had murdered? She let the silence stretch. The families in the front row leaned forward, eyes fixed on her. The defendant did not kill because he was poor, she continued. He killed because he wanted what others had. He killed because he could. He killed because he believed the lives of others were worth less than his own comfort. And for 30 years, he was right. Because no one stopped him. No one questioned him. No one looked beneath the floor of his cafe and asked why the ground smelled of tar. She turned, pointed straight at Said, still motionless in the dock, head bowed. This man is not a victim of circumstance. He is a predator, a man who hunted his own family for land, a man who murdered a tenant for refusing to leave a house, a man who killed a young woman because she asked too many questions. He is not asking for your mercy because he is sorry. He is asking for your mercy because he has been caught. She returned to her table and picked up a single photograph, the black and white image of Qasim El Berrada, the uncle whose bones had been found beneath the cafe. She held it up for the court to see. This man trusted his nephew, she said. He trusted him with his land, with his family, with his memory. And in return, he was beaten to death and buried under a cafe floor, sealed in tar, and forgotten for 30 years. The defendant did not just kill his uncle. He erased him. He erased all of them. He took their lives, their property, their names, and he would have kept on erasing them if a blocked drain had not finally exposed the truth. She set the photograph down and turned to the judge. The evidence is overwhelming. The confessions are clear. The bodies have been found. The forged documents have been authenticated. The accomplices have testified. There is only one verdict that can honor the memory of the dead and protect the living from this man. And that verdict is guilty, on all counts. The courtroom went silent. Even the journalists, scribbling notes through the whole trial, stopped writing. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at his papers, then back up at the defendant. Said El Berrada. The judge said, voice calm but firm, "Do you have anything you wish to say before the court retires to deliberate?" For a long moment, Said didn't move. The room held its breath. Then, slowly, he lifted his head. His face had gone gray, eyes sunken, and when he spoke, his voice dropped so low the court leaned in just to hear it. "I am sorry," he said. The words hung there, fragile, insufficient. He didn't elaborate, didn't look at the families, didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply lowered his head again, as if the weight of those 3 small words had drained the last of him. Amina Benjaloun shook her head slowly, lips pressed into a thin, bitter line. The sons of the tenants stared at the floor, hands clenched in their laps. The elderly aunt of Samira Kitani wiped her eyes with a crumpled tissue. "Sorry," they seemed to say without speaking. "Too little. Too late." The judge announced the court would recess while the panel considered the verdict. Guards led Said out through the side door, chains clinking softly. The families rose, stretching stiff limbs, speaking in low voices. Outside, the gray sky had darkened further, a cold drizzle beginning to fall, streaking the courthouse windows like tears. The waiting began. It would last 3 agonizing days. The families went home to empty houses, to photographs of the dead, to the quiet spaces where their loved ones used to sit. Casablanca went on with its business, the trial already slipping from the front pages as new scandals emerged. But in Dar el-Khair, the cafe stayed closed, doors chained, windows boarded, a silent monument to the horrors unearthed beneath its floor. And in the prison, Said Berrada sat alone in his cell, staring at the wall, waiting for the world to decide his fate. The man who had killed for 30 years, who had buried his victims in tar and concrete, who had hidden in plain sight behind the counter of a neighborhood cafe, was finally being held accountable. The bones had spoken. The witnesses had testified. The forged documents had been exposed. All that remained now was the judgment. And when it came, it would be final. The verdict came on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the closing arguments. The sky over Casablanca hung the color of old pewter, heavy with clouds that refused to break. A cold wind moved through the streets, carrying the smell of the sea and the faint, bitter scent of wood smoke from the surrounding neighborhoods. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Journalists, curious onlookers, but mostly the families of the dead. They stood in small clusters, speaking little, faces drawn and pale. They'd waited for this moment for years, some of them for decades, and now that it had finally arrived, they seemed almost afraid to walk through the doors. The courtroom was packed to capacity, every bench filled, every corner occupied. Journalists spilled into the aisles, clutching notebooks and recording devices. The families sat in the front rows as they had throughout the trial, a silent wall of grief and expectation. Amina Benjaloun sat there, black dress crisp and proper, hands folded in her lap. The sons of the tenant, Abdul Karim El Gwamusi, sat beside her, shoulders stiff, eyes fixed on the empty bench where the judge would soon appear. The aunt of Samira Katani was there too, smaller than ever, wrapped in a gray shawl that seemed to swallow her whole. The side door opened, and guards led Said Berrada into the courtroom. He walked with difficulty, steps slow and shuffling, as if the chains around his ankles had grown heavier overnight. His prison uniform hung loose on his frame, his face gray, skin stretched tight over his cheekbones. He didn't look at anyone, kept his eyes on the floor as the guards guided him to the dock and unlocked his handcuffs for the final time. Judge Abdelkader Benchakrown entered a few minutes later. The courtroom rose as one, then settled back into silence. He adjusted his glasses, arranged the papers before him, and looked out over the room. His face gave nothing away, but his voice, when it came, carried the full weight of the law. This court has reviewed the evidence, the testimony, and the arguments presented by both the prosecution and the defense, he began. The crimes before us are among the most grave that this court has ever been called upon to judge. Over a period of 30 years, the defendant, Said Berrada, committed acts of murder, fraud, and concealment that defy ordinary understanding. He took the lives of at least 8 people, some of them his own blood, and he did so with a calculation and a coldness that are difficult to comprehend. He paused, letting the words settle. The families leaned forward, hands gripping the edges of the benches. The journalists held their breath, pens poised. The evidence against the defendant is overwhelming, the judge continued. His own confession, recorded and played in this court, leaves no doubt as to his guilt. The forensic evidence, the testimony of witnesses, and the documents recovered from his property all point to the same conclusion. The defendant is not a victim. He is a predator, and the law must respond accordingly. He looked down at his papers, then back up, said, "El Berrada, please rise." Said stood slowly, body trembling slightly. The guards moved closer, hands hovering near his arms. For the first time in days, he raised his head and looked at the judge. On the charges of premeditated murder, the judge said, voice steady, "This court finds you guilty." On the charges of kidnapping, this court finds you guilty. On the charges of forgery of official documents, this court finds you guilty. On the charges of concealment of corpses, this court finds you guilty. On the charges of fraud, this court finds you guilty. The words fell like stones into still water. A gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by a low murmur the judge silenced with a raised hand. The family sat motionless, faces pale, eyes wide. Amina Benjaloun pressed a handkerchief to her lips. The sons of the tenant lowered their heads, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The judge continued, "The crimes of which you have been convicted are of such severity that they warrant the highest penalty available under Moroccan law. This court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. You will spend the remainder of your natural life in a high-security facility, where you will have ample time to reflect on the lives you have taken and the suffering you have caused. You will never again walk freely among the people of this country. You will never again sit behind the counter of a cafe, or shake the hand of a neighbor, or bury your victims beneath the floor. This court will not allow it. No death penalty." The judge had chosen life imprisonment, a sentence that, in its own way, cut crueler. For a man who'd spent his whole life controlling his environment, decades in a small cell with no freedom and no future amounted to a kind of slow death. The families had wanted more. Some had called for execution, but the law had spoken, and its word was final. Said didn't react. He stood in the dock, face blank, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the courtroom walls. No thanks to the judge. No further apology. He simply lowered his head, and the guards took his arms and led him away. The courtroom broke into a low hum of voices, but the families didn't cheer. No celebration, no sense of triumph, only a deep, bone-weary relief that it was finally over. Amina Benjaloun turned to embrace her neighbors, face wet with tears. The sons of the tenants stood together, arms around each other's shoulders, eyes red and swollen. The aunt of Samira Kitani rose slowly, shawl slipping from her shoulders, and walked toward the exit like a woman stepping out a long, dark tunnel. Outside, the crowd had grown. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, microphones thrust toward anyone who looked like a relative of the victims. But the family said little. They'd waited too long for this moment, and now that it had come, They wanted only to go home, close their doors, sit in the silence, and remember. Detective Inspector Hassan El Mansouri watched from the courthouse steps, hands in his coat pockets. He'd sat through every day of the trial, in the back, taking notes, listening. Now, as the crowd dispersed and the gray afternoon light began to fade, he felt a strange emptiness settle in. The case was closed. The killer was behind bars. But the dead were still dead, and the lives they might have lived would never be lived. The land Qasim El Berrada had died for would pass to someone else entirely. The Café, carrying its terrible secret, would be demolished, or sold, or simply left to rot. The community would move on, because communities always do. But the scars would remain, hidden beneath the surface, like bones under a floor. He thought about the block drain, the two laborers, the skull staring up out of the earth. A block drain. Of all the things that could have exposed this horror, something so small, so ordinary. If the drain hadn't clogged, if the smell hadn't turned unbearable, if the laborers had dug a few inches to the left, the bones might have stayed buried forever. The killer might have died a free man, respected and mourned by the very people he'd terrorized. Justice, in the end, had hinged on a coincidence, and that perhaps was the most terrifying part of all. El Mansouri turned up his collar and walked down the steps into the street. The wind was cold, the first drops of rain beginning to fall. He didn't look back at the courthouse. Other cases were waiting, other files, other mysteries. But he knew this one, the case of the Café killer, would stay with him for the rest of his life. The story of Said El Berrada isn't just a story about murder. It's a story about silence. The silence of a family that didn't ask questions. The silence of officials who never checked signatures. The silence of a community that didn't want to believe a monster could live among them. For 30 years, that silence protected a killer. It let him bury his victims beneath his own café, forge documents, steal land, destroy lives. And in the end, it wasn't the police, not the courts, not the system that finally broke the silence. It was a block drain, a simple accident, a random event no one could have predicted. But maybe that's how evil so often gets exposed. Not by great heroes or brilliant detectives, but by chance, by accident, by the slow accumulation of small things that finally grow too heavy to ignore. The bones under the café had been waiting there for decades, and when they were finally uncovered, they spoke with a voice no one could silence. As the rain began falling in earnest, the streets of Casablanca glistened under the streetlights. The city, so full of life and noise and movement, seemed to exhale. The trial was over. The killer was gone. The dead had been given their day. But the questions would linger, the way they always do in cases like this. How many more were there? How many other bones lay buried somewhere else, under some other floor, still waiting to be found? And how many monsters still walk among us, hiding in plain sight, serving tea, shaking hands, smiling at the neighbors? The answer, perhaps, isn't one we want to hear. But the truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. And the truth of Said El Berrada was this. He wasn't a monster from the shadows. He was a man from the neighborhood, a man everyone knew, a man everyone trusted. And that, in the end, is what made him so dangerous. The families of the victims returned to their homes that night, to empty chairs and silent rooms. They closed their doors and drew their curtains and sat in the dark, thinking of the ones they'd lost. And somewhere in a high-security prison on the outskirts of the city, a man in a gray uniform sat alone in his cell, staring at the wall, listening to the rain. The case of the Café killer was closed, but its shadow would linger for a long, long time. If you found this case compelling, hit the like button, subscribe, and share your theories in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next case.